The Nepalese kukri, made famous by the Gurkhas, one of the best forest knives you can get and one of the best fighting knives as well, used by any modern military or military of the last 200 years. Absolutely legendary weapon. In this video we're going to look at a few different types of kukri and we're going to look at some offerings from Kailash Blades. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, regular viewers of this channel will know I'm a huge fan of the Nepalese kukri. And over the years I've reviewed several, mostly for Kailash Blades, but also I've showed lots of antiques. In fact, just the other day I picked up this original Mark II from around World War I. And yeah, it's a really nice example, full width tang, and it's got its original, probably private purchase scabbard as well. And it's a nice piece. So my collection of antique kukris is ever growing. But for those of you who don't want to necessarily buy an antique or don't want to use an antique, because I realise there's a lot of people out there in the world who want to buy a knife to use, whether it's out in the forest or for hunting or anything like this, or even as a military knife, then you're going to want a modern one for the most part. And the company who I can recommend above all other, who are getting insanely close to the actual originals and historical originals, I mean basically the same, as good as, full replicas and made in Nepal ethically, with Nepalese workers reviving this tradition of kukri making, is Kailash Blades, and check out that link below. And in fact, here you can see me using, this is the Fort William Mark I, which is one of their very popular models. And this is a kind of workhorse. This is absolutely, if I have to go out, you know, if I had to go out in the woods and I was expecting to chop wood, but equally wanting a knife for other purposes as well, this is an absolute beast and will do the job beautifully. As you can see, this not only will chop wood of any, or foliage of any size pretty much, you can use it as a camp hatchet. Additionally, after doing that, it can then be used to slice water bottles, as good as any fighting knife. So not only is this an amazing woodsman's tool or hunter's tool, but in addition to that, it is an amazing fighting knife as well. Not only is it powerful, but it's also quick, keeps an awesome cutting edge, stays in the hand really well, tracks through its lines really well, very easy to align the edge, and surprisingly quick for what it feels like first in the hand. You first of all feel this is a beast of a chopper, but actually it can change direction and maneuver really quickly. Now, this Fort William Mark I type was a type that came around at the very beginning of the 20th century, so they were still in use in World War I, but they were really being used from the right the way through the Edwardian period, so from about 1900, and in fact there's very similar examples from the 1890s as well. And they ultimately led to the Mark II in many ways, the difference being that the Mark II has a full width tang. There's a few other differences as well, but if you want to quickly spot the difference, the Mark II has a full width tang, built like a bayonet grip, for example. And these were military issue. You could also get them private purchase. That's probably an officer's version because of the scabbard. But they were clearly built primarily as well, partly as sidearms, but also as tools as well. Now, not to say, of course, you can use any tool as a sidearm. You could use a shovel or a wood chopping axe as a sidearm if you need to. And kukris, of course, are even more better adapted to being sidearms. They are fighting weapons. But the Fort William, as mentioned, is a formidable tool in its right, but it's maybe not the quickest kukri in the world. Now, although types like this do go all the way back into right the way through the 19th century, and in fact into the 18th century, we do find a tendency for earlier kukris to sometimes be a little bit slimmer, a little bit more lightly built. And that's what brings us to Kailash Blades Salyani. Now, what this is essentially is a hanshi style kukri, which you'll notice it has a greater degree of curve, and rather than having a sort of angular broken back like some later kukris, it's one continuous banana-like curve, almost like a boomerang. So it curves all the way through the blade, and the grip as well. So the grip has a curvature to it which carries on through the spine, and then the spine is one even curve. And you'll notice that the belly, as it were, the width of the blade is not so much, and often they're longer. You'll notice this is longer. They can come in various lengths from Kailash Blades, so you know, check out that link below, but you can order them to the length of your preference. So you can have them a normal kind of 12-13 inch blade, or you can have them much bigger than that. Now, this type of kukri, while you could use it as a tool, you could use it for some types of bushcraft, possibly. it's not really that well suited to that. This is more of a sidearm, more of a fighting weapon. And that's how the kukris, of course, going back into the 19th century, were often used, at least when they were carried by Gurkhas. They were principally weapons. Now, given that I have a massive interest in 19th century swords and firearms and 19th century warfare, particularly things like the Indian Mutiny and the Sikh Wars and this kind of stuff, kukris were a major weapon at that time, and in fact kukris and the Gurkhas featured quite heavily in the Indian Mutiny, for example, but then also subsequent campaigns, for example in Afghanistan and the Northwest Frontier and so on and so forth. And therefore this type of kukri is of particular interest to me because it's a type that's not particularly popular or like prevalent in the 20th century, but was extremely popular and important in the 19th century. So I was drawn initially to Kailash Blades because they were one of the few companies that were really taking a serious look at these. Now, when I started talking with the team at Kailash, one of the things that came up is they weren't that sure about the spine thickness, and based on our discussion and testing, we came up with a thicker spined version, which I believe is closer to the originals. So this version has a thicker spine here, and therefore, because it starts thicker here but ends up the same thickness up here, it has a greater degree of distal taper. Now, some of you might not realise that, you might know about distal taper in swords, you might not realise it's a thing in knives as well. Now, modern knife makers, a lot of them don't really put distal taper in anything. Their blades are just a flat slab and they just cut out a shape. Now, with a relatively short blade, sub sword length, it doesn't always matter that much. However, I will tell you, my opinion is that 19th century machetes with nice distal taper are much nicer to use. They're stiffer, they're more responsive in the hand, they send less hand shock through and things like this, and they're more durable, I believe, as well, than modern flat, basically chopped out of a flat plate or laser jet cut out of a flat plate versions of machetes. Now that's machetes. When we come to knives, shorter knives, as I say, it doesn't always matter, you don't always notice distal taper, but with a kukri, the longer it gets, the more I believe that distal taper starts to be something you need to pay attention to. That's not to say that all kukris necessarily have a lot of distal taper. I'll just grab another antique here. So this is one from the Nepalese cache that came out of Nepal in the 1980s, I think it was. Now what's interesting is this is a bloody great beefy massive thing of a so-called longleaf kukri. This is massive, okay? This is, I would say, more of a tool than a fighting weapon, but it is big. But what's interesting is a lot of modern reproductions of kukris might make these out of almost a flat slab with only a little bit of distal taper up here. But this is actually considerably thicker there at the base than it is there at the middle. So it does have distal taper, despite the fact it looks like something that might not. Now, when we come to a very light and responsive blade like the Kailash Salyani here, that distal taper makes a huge difference. And what's interesting is with the original one, that was, I would say, a bit too thin at the spine, it feels a bit flimsy. Now, it's not to say you don't find historical originals like that, you do sometimes, but it just doesn't feel right in the hand. It's difficult to articulate more precisely than that. I have tried in a previous video, but basically we thickened up the spine, it led to a better thing. But they've got even further now. So they have now got the next generation of the Salyani. Now, this is just a work of art. And note also that this one has a horn grip, which is an option. But we'll talk about the differences in a second. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the epitome. This is as good as any of the originals I've seen. And as it so happens, I literally, 2 days ago, I was at the Gurkha Museum in Winchester and I was looking at an Indian Mutiny period kukri that was extremely similar to this, if not in overall blade shape necessarily, in decoration and form. This is, as I consider it, the best replica of a mid-19th century Gurkha's kukri that I've ever seen. Not to say there aren't other great makers out there. I know there are. There's some other really good kukri makers in the world. But based on what I've had through my hands, Kailash Blades are making the best 19th century, or frankly 20th century kukris that I have held, and they continue to advance and they continue to get better. This is absolutely gorgeous. Let's look at a few of its differences compared to the previous generation. So the first thing is that spine thickness. The spine has thickened up a little bit again, not so much at the base, so a tiny bit at the base, but more further up here. That is, it still has the distal taper, but it keeps it tapers less in the first half of the blade, so it keeps more of that thickness for the first half of the blade. And this, in my mind, it adds a little bit more presence to the blade, which, you know, maybe it won't be to everyone's taste, but it's certainly to mine. It adds a bit more presence to what's fundamentally a relatively narrow blade. But it also adds, therefore, a lot more metal to this first part of the blade here, which fundamentally makes it stronger as well in the narrowest and potentially weakest part of the blade. That being said, even with the spine thickened up and having a bit more blade presence, this is still a really, really quick, really maneuverable Hanshi style kukri. It is not as beefy and choppy as some of the more utilitarian and 20th century military kukris. This is still, by kukri standards, a really quick and maneuverable weapon. It's just got a little bit more presence and a little bit more solidness in the hand. Now, the next thing to mention is grip lengths. Now, Andrew at Kailash Blades actually knows that I prefer a shorter grip, so that's what he sent me this time. You might notice on screen that the older version has got a longer grip. They are actually options, so don't worry too much about that. It's not that there's necessarily a change from before, it's just that this one has been sent to me with a shorter grip because they know that's what I prefer personally. But if you want a longer grip, and it has to be said, the Hanshi style kukri often do have longer grips. So if you want a longer grip, that's perfectly historically accurate, and you can just select it from the drop down on the Kailash Blades website. Now, a more subtle change is you will notice that the end of the fuller here comes up in quite an angular way and meets the back of the blade. That's perfectly historical. The new version instead is rounded and finishes it sort of comes back to meet the spine of the blade. So they're just simply slightly different ways of ending the fuller. As I say, they're both perfectly historically accurate, and it's to a degree, this is personal taste. My personal taste is that I prefer this rounded end, and it looks, somehow it makes the tip look more finished and more refined and defined as well. So I personally do prefer the end of that fuller. Your mileage might vary, and if you wanted the other type, I'm sure you could request it of Kailash Blades, because they can do any custom work you like. Another very minor difference is the previous end of the grip was a little bit more flared than the current one. It's been reduced slightly. That again is personal taste, and you could request more or less if you liked. I have to say, on the Hanshi style grips, we often do see less flare. So this, you know, they're both historically accurate, but that is maybe more in keeping with the Hanshi style hilt or grip. Another minor but really nice little addition is on the old Salyani, the butt plate, pommel cap, whatever you want to call it, at the bottom here. So the tang comes through and is peened, and then there's a plate over the top protecting the bottom of here. The reason that's important, incidentally, is you have a lot of lateral stress, and these bits of wood, if they get knocked on things, can get split off. But if you have that plate there, it just helps protect them. That plate was completely plain on the original. Now, again, nothing wrong with that, perfectly historical. In fact, I've got an antique example here. If we look at the Mark II, it's completely plain. It's rusty, but it's completely plain. But that big sort of flat, shiny plate, I think, can look a little bit odd. So something I absolutely love that they've done on the new version is they've added a little bit of decoration to the base there. Now, another difference that Kailash pointed out to me that I hadn't noticed at first is the ring height, the ring distance between the ferrule and the where the ring rises in the middle has changed slightly, and this new version does mean that you get the traditional 2 fingers over and 2 fingers under grip in the right place. I'd never really noticed, to be completely honest, because it's a fairly subtle ring, or was, but actually this grip puts me 3 fingers above and 1 below, which is not usual to the antiques that I'm aware of. Most of the antiques have 2 above and 2 below. So moving that ring up, I think, was absolutely the right thing to do. Now, a really subtle difference is the cho area down here, the notch, which I've done so many videos about. That's actually been refined slightly on the newest ones. On the old ones, it's still really good, but it was just not quite as finished off. You'll notice it's quite square cut, whereas the new one has got, try and focus on it, there we go, has got slightly more beveled and just a bit higher degree of finish essentially on the cho. And it does actually notice, when you notice it, you notice it, even though it's very subtle. It is better done on the newer ones. But there is one bigger difference, And this is quite big. So in terms of decoration, so a lot of people think about the overall form of these, and that is really important and really difficult to get right actually for kukris. But you will notice on the older one, it's got quite simplistic decoration around the middle. Again, perfectly historical, nothing wrong with it. But the new one really goes above and beyond on the carving. I really want to show you this. Look at that. I mean, that carving in that horn, just above the ring there, is leagues and leagues higher quality and more complex. So essentially that puts this into a slightly higher status, I would say, kukri category. It's not more or less historical, but it is a more professionally made decoration around there than the previous one, which is just cruder and more basic quality. So I would say now that the decoration around there matches the quality of the metal fittings, which are very high. By 19th century standards, this would be a fairly high status, you know, kind of officer quality kukri. It's not like royalty or nobility standard, but it is a kind of a good officer's quality kukri of the mid-19th century, and extremely, extremely historically accurate. I literally can't think of anything to criticise about this kukri from a historical replication point of view now. It is exactly the Hanshi style, a good officer quality Hanshi style kukri of the Indian Mutiny period. We also shouldn't forget to mention the scabbards as well. The scabbards come in various styles, some more traditional, some more modern. You can choose one of each. You can get your kukri with 2 different scabbards, for example. And these are fantastically made. There's still a continual living tradition of scabbard making for kukris in Nepal. So these are exactly like the period ones. One thing I would mention is, now that I've got 4 or 5 of the Kailash Blades kukris, you will notice there's a variation of fit between some models and others. Sometimes the scabbard's a little bit tight and you've got to wear it in a little bit. Sometimes you might find putting some oil on the blades and basically taking it in and out quite a lot will help. Sometimes it's not so tight and it's perfect from the outset. Sometimes changes in the environment, so if you live in a damper country, the wood will swell and things like that. Also how you treat the leather, whether you put some sort of leather feed on it or whatever, will change certain things and might change the suppleness of the leather. Some of the leather can, particularly on the frogs I found, can be a little bit on the dry side when it comes to you, but if you use some type of dubbin or saddle soap or something on it, that will soften up. In terms of the fit, remember, strictly speaking, you're not supposed to put your fingers around the front of the cutting edge side, so you hold it like that and you push towards the back and you make sure the tip doesn't dig into the wood, so you keep the tip away from the back of the wood and push towards the back. It should go easily in and easily out. And as this particular one's actually fairly loose. Well, it doesn't fall straight out, but it's fairly loose, so no problems going in and out. Others of them can be a little bit tighter. So my Fort William, for example, is quite tight. It's partly to do with the shape of the blade as well. This has got a bigger belly to it, so it's a bit more of a fiddle to get in and out. So it does, you know, go in and out without a huge amount of trouble. It's actually, there we go. But I had to work that in a little bit. I had to get a bit used to it. So they're beautifully made scabbards, but the fit can sometimes vary a bit from example to example. Now, the final thing to mention in terms of options is, you'll see, if you check out the website below, you see they've got a whole bunch of different models. The Salyani we're looking at here, this is the model, this is for me the kind of optimum model. This is the one I'd carry on my side as a sidearm, and 100% this is what I choose. I love the horn grip, but you can get a wooden grip or other materials as well potentially. You can get different types of scabbard if you want a different type of scabbard. You can get a different grip length, but as well as grip length, you can get different blade lengths. Now this one, which is a perfect sort of optimum size I think for a large fighting knife, 15.5 inches I think it is. So that's pretty big. It's bigger than most Bowie knives are. So you're going to be able to outreach in a fight most people with a large knife. And that's big enough and it's easy to carry. However, I understand some of you out there would love to have a bigger chopper. And you can get one, boys and girls. If you really want a bigger chopper, you can get one. This is the XL. I've called it the XL. They don't call it the XL. This is the 17.5 inch Salyani. And oh my God, and incidentally, this is a bit of a stiffer scabbard, this one. I haven't worked it in yet. This is just mental. I just don't know. I almost don't know what to to do with this. I mean, hit things with it, but this is monstrously big kukri, and you'll notice also it's got a correspondingly longer hanshi style grip or hilt on it. So you could hold this lower down, you could hold it higher up, depending on what you're doing. Probably if you were doing some type of, I don't know, whittling. Why would you whittle with this? But anyway, you know, if you want finer control, you'd hold it at the top. If you want to reach further and chop more powerfully, you'd hold it further down. You've got some options there. And it's interesting that a lot of the early kukris do have longer hilts on them. A bit like a Burmese dar or a bit like a medieval German Langmesser. There is this tradition for having slightly longer grips when you make a big knife bigger and bigger and bigger, and you end up with a dar, a knife, a messer. They're similar related weapons. When you make them bigger, often in many parts of the world, different cultures have come to the same solution of making the hilt longer in order to balance them, but it does give you other options to do. So for example, if you're holding up here and you're fighting with this thing, it does give you hooking options with the bottom, just like it would do with a dar or a wakizashi or a messer. So that's one thing, the grip. The blade, so how would you fight with the thing? I mean, you could just fight with it. This is machete size now, isn't it? So 17.5 inches, this is going to be standing toe to toe with several types of short sword or machete type weapons. In terms of reach, in terms of chopping power, you'll find that this is even more formidable. I mean, this is almost the size of a falcata or a kopis. So therefore, I've got a theory. With these large hanshi style kukris, we know, because there's written references, I've even read out some of the accounts on my channel in the past, of Gurkhas in the 18th century when, well, certainly 18th and early 19th century, so the early 19th century when the British first started encountering them, and they're described as using kukris and shields and swords as well. So they would have talwars, sometimes palwars if they'd been over to Afghanistan for a bit of campaigning. So they'd end up with long swords or large kukris used with a shield. So if we put this into, and that's now we're getting into a comparison between like the Iberians in the time of the ancient Greek world, you know, or the Roman Republic, using a falcata with a shield, well, using a kukri with a dal or a shield. So absolutely, I think this becomes a large weapon of in its own right, rather than just a little sidearm, something that you could absolutely use like a mainstream sword. We're getting into the world of swords here now, short swords anyway. So there we go. As far as I'm concerned, Kailash Blades, again, there we go, it's a little bit stiff to get in this one, but make sure you push to the back, don't get the point stuck, and don't put your fingers over there just in case something goes wrong. Kailash Blades, as far as I'm concerned, are, I'm not going to say they're the only good manufacturer of kukris out there, because I don't want to belittle anyone. I know there's some other fantastic companies making kukris in Nepal, and full respect to them. But Kailash are the company that I've been having a back and forth with, looking at some of their products. Potentially we'll do some work together in the future. And I've got the pleasure of having some in my hand. And I have a collection of about, I don't know, 30 or 40 antique kukris. And to me, they are now at a point where they're making kukris that are as good and in some cases better than the historical originals. I wish I could say that of all the sword makers out in the world. So not only can you get a 100% Nepalese traditionally made kukri right now that is exactly like one from the 19th or even 18th centuries, or you could get a World War I period or a World War II period or a modern one. They also do custom work as well. So lots of love to Kailash. Check out the links below. Go and look at their wonderful offerings, and bear in mind that they will do custom orders as well, or customize standard things as well. So different grip material, different length of blade, whatever. They are absolutely the dog's proverbials when it comes to kukri making, as far as I'm concerned. And it is an absolute joy and a pleasure to own these little bundles of magnificence from Kailash Blades. So thanks a lot to Kailash for sending these. I just can't wait to see what you do next, and I can't wait to collaborate more with you in the future, because I absolutely love your work. Yeah, fantastic. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.